boys and girls. Welcome to Storytime with Nonie and Finnegan. Well, Much Afraid and her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, had crossed the desert, they had walked along the shores of loneliness, and they had climbed Mount Injury. And now they were beginning their journey through the forest of danger and tribulation, great trouble. But you know, the interesting thing was that Much Afraid really wasn't even afraid. She remembered what the shepherd had told her. He had said, "Much Afraid, if you stay on my path, nothing will really be able to hurt you." It wasn't long before Much Afraid saw the sickly face of Self-Pity poking out from behind one of the trees.
Poor little Much Afraid. Why should the shepherd lead a lame, frightened thing like you through dangers and troubles? Really, I think this time he's gone too far. Resentment peered out from behind another tree. There are other ways to get to the high places. Tell him you won't go this way. This path is only for the strong and courageous. Bitterness was next. What does he think he is doing? After all you've been through, still, he always has something worse ahead. And then craven fear and pride stood on the path in front of them. You will never make it through this danger and trouble. You might as well give up and go back.
Much Afraid tried to keep walking, but she found that she just limped along painfully whenever she heard their voices. She couldn't put her fingers in her ears because that would mean she'd have to let go of the hands of her helpers, and she couldn't do that. So finally, she asked Sorrow and Suffering if they had any ideas, and Suffering reached around in her little first aid kit, and she pulled out a couple pieces of cotton and stuck them in Much Afraid's ears, and that really helped. Her enemies realized that she couldn't hear them, and so they left for a little bit and thought that they would come back and try to get her attention later on and see if they could turn her around and get her to go back down that mountain. At first, the forest didn't seem all that bad. The sun was shining. It was a beautiful day. But the sun didn't shine for long. Soon, storm clouds began gathering. They came rolling in. They were coming in so quickly. And the thunder and lightning began. And Much Afraid and her helpers found themselves in the middle of a very big storm.
The funny thing was that Much Afraid really wasn't all that frightened. She spoke to herself words from the great book. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near to you. You only look and see the reward of the wicked. I will cover you with my feathers, and under my wings you'll take refuge.
Much Afraid and her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, stopped to wring the water out of their very wet clothes when all of a sudden Craven Fear appeared, and he yelled at Much Afraid as loudly as he could. "Much Afraid, do you think the storm is over? It's not. It's going to come back at any minute, and you barely have enough time to make it back down this mountain away from these dangerous trees, so hurry, hurry, Much Afraid." "Listen," said Much Afraid to her helpers, Sorrow and Suffering, "I am just getting really tired of listening to their voices. Would you girls help me?" And they reached down and they picked up some rocks. Much Afraid threw the rock at Craven Fear, and then her friends Sorrow and Suffering started laughing, and they started picking up rocks and throwing them at the enemies. And those enemies went scurrying off into the forest. At a bend, and they saw a little hut. It was perfect timing too, because the clouds did come rolling back in, and another storm was about to hit. And oh my goodness, this one looked huge. And so Much Afraid and Sorrow and Suffering hurried into the little hut, and Suffering locked the door behind them. And it was just in the nick of time, for there at the door came a knock. "Let us in! Let us in!" And it was the voice of her enemies. They said, "We're out here, and you can't leave us out here in this storm. It's a terrible storm. Let us in." And Much Afraid just said, "Well, then you'd better hurry. You just have barely enough time to make it back down the mountain away from these dangerous trees. So hurry, hurry now." Well, they did. They heard the screaming of feet just as the thunder began to really pound the ground outside.
Inside the hut, Much Afraid and her helpers found everything they needed to stay warm and comfortable. And in a short time, the storm raged outside, and the three of them were sitting around a crackling fire drinking hot chocolate. Much Afraid realized with surprise that this was the happiest and the most peaceful part of her journey. Imagine that! In a big storm, she was not afraid. She had peace. And as they laid down on their mattresses that they found piled in the corner, she repeated to herself softly, "He has covered me with his feathers, and under his wings I'll find refuge." The storm continued for several days, and Much Afraid came to know sorrow and suffering in a whole new way. She began to understand more of their mountain language, and she found that they were becoming more than just her helpers. They were her friends.
Finally, the storm had stopped, and Much Afraid and her helpers opened up the door and realized that it was time for them to leave their little hut. So they began on their journey again. But even though the storm had lifted, it was very foggy outside, that Much Afraid could barely see but a few feet in front of her. Well, Much Afraid, after a while, just said out loud, "I wonder if this fog is ever going to lift." That's when Much Afraid heard the voice of resentment. I think sometimes when we say things out loud, start complaining, somebody's going to answer back.
"No, it won't," said Resentment. "This is how it is all the way up the mountains. It's going to be like this for the rest of your journey." Much Afraid pretended not to hear him, but he kept on talking. "Have you noticed, Much Afraid, that the path isn't even going up? It's staying level. You missed the upward way, and now you're just going to go round and round in circles." Much Afraid hadn't really noticed this, but now she realized it was true. They weren't climbing at all. She turned to her friends. "Do you think we might have missed the right path? The fog's so thick, maybe we have gone past it without realizing it." They reminded her not to listen to her relatives, to her fearing relatives, her enemies. "This is the way the shepherd told us to follow. We will stay on it." So Much Afraid kept on. She was stumbling and falling on that slippery path. And then bitterness broke in clearly, and he said, "Well, you should at least go back and look instead of going on and on the wrong way." "Oh, you poor little thing," self-pity whispered through the mist.
The voices just kept going on, and finally Much Afraid thought of something. She said, "Maybe if I sing loud enough, I won't be able to hear them."
And so the bedraggled, wet, cold Much Afraid began to sing one of the songs from the great book, the Bible. Her enemies immediately got quiet. "Oh, what a good idea," she thought. "This works much better than putting cotton in my ears." And she sang even more loudly. And then Much Afraid heard a voice beside her that she knew and loved. "Hello, Much Afraid," said the shepherd. "I like that song that you're singing." Much Afraid was so happy to see him, but a little embarrassed by how she looked. She wondered how long he had been walking with them and how many times he had seen her slip and fall. "Much Afraid," he said softly, knowing that she was embarrassed. "I don't think of you as you are now. When I look at you, I see you as you will be when I've brought you to the kingdom of love. When I notice you finding the path hard and you're slipping and falling, it only makes me think of what you will be like when you're leaping and skipping on the high places." Much Afraid reached out and took his hand. And they walked on, singing the song together.
Boys and girls, there are going to be storms in our life. Sure, there will be storms with thunder and lightning and rain, but there's other kinds of storms too. A storm is something that interrupts our peace. Things that we don't expect, that seem to come out of nowhere. When something bad happens to you, that's usually what we think of storms. Storms can be things like, when you get sick. Maybe one of your animals dies, or maybe your house burns down, or maybe your mom or dad loses their job. These are all storms of life. Satan wants to use those storms to try to get us to turn around and walk away from God. He wants us to become angry and bitter about these storms that come into our life. He wants us to be resentful, just like much afraid face those same enemies, or self-pity, feel sorry for these bad things that are happening to us. But Jesus tells us in Philippians 4:9, he says, "Practice what you have heard and saw me do. The God who gives peace will be with you." You see, boys and girls, it's Jesus who gives us that peace. He's the Prince of Peace. You see, boys and girls, Much Afraid was practicing what the shepherd had told her to do. Much Afraid took the truth of God's Word that she knew and had learned, and she began singing it and speaking it. And the enemy hates that. Satan and his demons, they don't like it when we sing praises to God. Do you know why? Because Jesus inhabits the praises of his people. The Lord lives in the praises of his people. When we practice what his word tells us to do, like praising God in the middle of the storms of life, that's like actually asking God to come into that very place where you are, and he's the one who stills the storm. Boys and girls, thank you for joining us on Storytime with Nonie, and I'll see you next time. Love you. Bye-bye.